about the state of the LGBTQ union. With me today are Janson, Executive Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force, tre'andre Valentine, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, and Mary Bonato, GLAAD's Civil Rights Project Director. I always feel like it's that awkward moment, like on Jeopardy, when they say your name, you kind of do that kind of short smile. So thank you all for joining me today. Before we get started, a little housekeeping. We are recording this event and we'll share the link with everyone who registered. If you have questions for our panelists, please post them in the Q&A box, which you select at the bottom of your window. I know we've received some great questions already, and we'll do our best to respond to as many as time allows. Closed captioning should appear on the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties with captioning or anything else, please just post in the chat window and someone will help you out. Finally, I want to thank the many supporters who make the work of all of our organizations possible. To learn more about each of our organizations, I welcome you to visit our websites and follow everyone on social media. And you can see those links in the chat. All right, so on to our topic for today. So the state of the LGBTQ union is obviously a really big topic, and there's a lot we could talk about, and we're not going to be able to get to it all. But let me just start with a little check-in on how we're doing in this moment. And by this moment, I mean the fact that we've just come through 4 years of anti-LGBTQ, racist, anti-immigrant, anti-democratic attacks under the Trump administration. We are just at the 1-year mark of a global pandemic that's led to over 500,000 deaths in the US alone. And that's laid bare glaring health disparities and has caused incredible stress and isolation and economic devastations for so many. Last year, we also saw renewed calls for urgent racial justice reforms spurred by ongoing police killings of Black Americans. And 2020, as we all remember, was capped off by a huge record high turnout election, resulting in leadership change in the historic election of Kamala Harris as our vice president, but also false claims of fraud and a white supremacist insurrection at our Capitol. So suffice it to say, many in our communities are feeling stressed, are feeling exhausted, worried, and hopefully, looking forward to change and progress in the next, in this new federal administration. So let me just start off with a little check-in to see how are you feeling coming through all of that, and now just over 1 month into the Biden-Harris administration. And tre'andre, let me start with you first.
Thanks, Janson. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I am tired, exhausted, traumatized, and thinking, yeah, we're 1 month into a new administration, but it's not going to undo the 4 years of havoc that has been wreaked, right? And so while I do remain hopeful, I'm not ignorant about what is going on, what's happening. The trauma has not stopped, right? The trauma continues. And to be honest, to hear talk about healing just makes me grinds my gears a little bit, because how can you heal when the trauma is still actively happening around you and directly to you and in your face? So it's like leaving an abusive partner, to be honest, and still having the aftermath of that, and I can go on about that an infinitum, but it's a lot, and the community is feeling a lot and is experiencing a lot. And while we are resilient, we are #exhausted and traumatized.
Exhausted, traumatized, I think, aptly summarizes a lot, and it's been 4 years. And so to expect 1 month to cure everything is obviously a little unrealistic. How about you, Kiara?
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I I always get stuck when I'm asked that question. I don't know why, because it's the same stuck for this, like, for the whole year, for this last year, right? Someone's like, how are you doing? And you're like, fine, I guess. A friend of mine says, I'm COVID good. You know, it's all right. It's all relative. You know, tre'andre, what you were saying really resonates with me, in that, you know, it's, you know, we have been, you know, inundated, right, with literal and figurative, like, violence, right? Like, you know, being hurled at us across our different communities as queer people, as Black folks, as women, as femme people, as, right, like, immigrants, as, right, like, you name it. And it feels like our very, like, the core of our humanity has been questioned, chewed up, spit out, right, and has been allowed to be traumatized over and over and over and over and over again in the name of freedom, right? In the name of American. And so, you know, there's that part of me that does feel, I'm not physically tired, but I am emotionally tired. And on the flip side of that, there's so much, there's so much that we've seen in the last 4 years that also excites me, right? It invigorates me. And not even just the last 4 years. You know, let's go even a little further back. Like, I think we are seeing changes and shifts happening, right? We are in the middle of history making, right? It's like, it's this weird time where, you know, like, our grandkids are going to be reading about this, the time that we're in. And it feels good that not only, you know, yes, we will be able to talk about the trauma, the violence, the tensions, the exhaustion, but we will also be able to talk about how we witnessed shifts in power, right? That we've witnessed proactive policies that, you know, created a better quality of life for our people, that we witnessed, you know, inching closer to a new world that, you know, 50, 60, 80, 100 years ago, we could never even think of. So yeah, I'm also 3 weeks into a new position. So I am like, what's that saying? Like, you're like drinking water from a fire hose. But I'm a little bit of that too.
I should have mentioned that Kira is the new leader of the task force. So congratulations and welcome. You know, I know you've had leadership, you know, across the LGBTQ movement and other movements, but we're really excited to have you at the helm of the task force. So congratulations. Mary, anything you hear resonate?
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments, and I'm very honored to be here with each of you. I want to say that. I have to say the administration of the last 4 years was worse than I imagined. I think it wore me down, and I hear that it affected everybody. But I have to say, because I just have to be a glass half full person, that I was so amazed about how people rose up and stood up. You know, like, remember those, just all the people at the borders, all the people showing up at airports. You know, I think about people just showing up so much more. I think about, you know, there were so many attempts, and so many, in fact, successful attempts by the administration to undo important protections, to try to weed LGBTQ people out of existing protections. And, you know, there's this federal process of notice and comment rulemaking. And, you know, can I say, we took it over, right? We transformed it by having so many people participate in that, because, again, the idea is the federal government's supposed to deal with all those comments and answer all of them. And people just got involved. What I'm trying to say is, out there with themselves, out there with their expertise. And I think all of that kind of thing made a difference. And when I think about just the relentless grinding, you know, attacks that we experienced in so many ways, whether it's repro rights or the Muslim ban, you know, ICE detention, all of that, plus the specific, I'm going to take you out of shelter protections. I'm going to take you, I'm going to rescind that school guidance for trans students, et cetera, et cetera. I just have to say, like, to me, it's also kind of amazing, and it makes you feel like it's really true that we're on the side of right here when you see that, like, a judge still enjoins a trans sports ban in Idaho. You know, when you see a decision like Bostock, written by President Donald Trump's first appointment to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, you know, like, we've also had some significant wins, you know, but I'm with both of you in saying, like, there's a lot to recover from, and we're not done with it, as we know. So I'm happy that we're in a different era, but it feels like it's going to take some growing into that, because so much has been unleashed, of Trump and Trumpism, and we're not done with it.
No, we certainly are not done with that. And I think that's what we're going to be diving into a lot more in the next hour. Tre'andre, let's talk a little bit more focused about our communities, and specifically with the trans and gender non-conforming communities. MTPC, which for those folks who don't know, is the statewide trans organization in Massachusetts, who GLAAD has worked with, over, I don't know how many different projects and initiatives over the campaigns over the years. So really strong, amazing partner to GLAAD. You just recently completed a community assessment. Can you share some of the top priorities you've heard from the trans and gender nonconforming community in Massachusetts? How's that changed with the pandemic and other events of the past years? And have you, I don't know how much you talk to folks in other states, but are you seeing similarities across states?
Thanks, Janson. So yeah, MTPC, we conducted a community needs assessment between December of 2019 to the right up until the lockdown of last year, actually. And I think one thing that and this is connected, the one thing that we didn't really talk about in the beginning is really how many trans people were murdered last year, which was increased by more than half from 2019, right? Like, there's so much violence against trans people last year. And one of the things that we looked at was people's experience of safety. Now, this is by no means like a comprehensive needs assessment. But one of the things that came to light in terms of people's safety was that the biggest concern for them was public harassment, as well as suicide and sexual violence. And so I think those things are related, right? The culture in which we're living in, the leadership in which we have, these are related. And we also saw that we asked people about their basic needs, health needs, social support, access to services, legal needs. And in terms of the basic needs, and I think this is in line with the National US Trans Survey done by the National Center for Trans Equality, is that one of the highest concerns for people in Massachusetts was employment and housing, being able to pay their bills, having access to gender affirming resources, and having insurance coverage, a knowledgeable provider. And while we do have our sort of trans rights protected here in Massachusetts, right? The laws and the policies only go so far. And they're not enough, right? We don't actually see a true implementation of public accommodations, because during the pandemic, trans people were being denied care left and right, simply because of their gender identity. And there was, I think there's been an increase in homelessness, an increase in food insecurity. And this was, the pandemic just exacerbated the issues that trans people were already facing. And so it really sort of not came to light, but it really just showed starkly how much, even though Massachusetts puts itself at the forefront of LGBT rights and trans rights, that really a lot of work needs to be done. A lot more work needs to be done. And there needs to be some kind of accountability put in place. And there needs to be, there really needs to be a shift in culture. Not having a knowledgeable provider, right? People are having to seek care out sometimes outside of Massachusetts. And so there needs to be a lot more in place, a lot more training, a lot more support for organizations, for businesses, for schools, for healthcare facilities, even within our own LGBT organizations. There is still a struggle to actually have trans inclusion. And I mean, there's only so much I can say, but there's honestly a lot more work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, listening to you talk reminds me so much of that. I think it's Maslow's kind of pyramid of needs, where our goal is always to try to get our community to the top of that pyramid, which is kind of about self-fulfillment and self-actualization and self-esteem. But so much of our community is struggling with the bottom of that pyramid, which is basic food, safety, security, housing, and healthcare. And so the pandemic has only just really laid that even starker. A follow-up question from the audience, which is just to talk a little bit more about the advocacy that's being done on behalf of non-binary folks, particularly young people. This is certainly an area we've been working on for many years, but is kind of coming to the forefront right now in ways that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been such a focus on the binary, even within trans communities, right? Just trying to get people to understand what transgender means. And there has been really an erasure of just non-binary people, folks who are gender non-conforming, folks who may be gender fluid, two-spirit folks. And really, the young people are not having it. Let's just be real. They're not having it, okay? And so I think it is our job, my job, to really follow the lead of the young people, because they're the ones, they're the future. And they know who they are. People are like, oh, well, they're so young, they're still developing and all this other stuff. But no, they know who they are. And there needs to be a lot more conversation about non-binary people. And we need to follow the lead of the youth, because they are the ones who, they know best. They know themselves best. And we need to pay a lot more attention to that. And people can be leaders at any point in their life. They can be 3 years old. They can be 83 years old, right?
I just want to co-sign on that with you, tre'andre. Like it's like, one of our colleagues talks about teach the babies and let the babies teach you, right? And it's real. Like I remember my my middle kid was 5 years old, and I will never forget. They were taking a bath, and one day, and just kind of paused and was like, "Mommy, sometimes I feel a little bit like a boy, and sometimes I feel a little bit like a girl." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And they're like, well, what, is that okay? Like, is that, and I was like, well, of course, we're kind of all a little bit of boy, a little bit of a girl. I was like, and you get to be whatever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want. And their face was like the satisfaction of that. And you saw me hesitate on their pronouns. I'm actually practicing myself, because they are now 10. And we're, filling out check boxes, right? And I make a habit of asking, like I just ask every time there's a check box. And I was like, okay, so these are the pronouns that they're saying, right, are available to you, or no pronouns. And they're like, I really think they, them, he, his works for me. And I was like, okay, done. And now I'm practicing, right? Again, let the babies teach you, let the babies lead you. And I have work to do, right? Like I have always used he, him pronouns, since the time he was born. And then once it was said, I was like, I've got my marching orders. I've got to do my work, right? Like, don't play. Like, they already said who they are and where they feel comfortable, and now it's your job, right, to take their lead. So I'm high-fiving you on that one.
Well, what I also, thank you for jumping in that, Kira. What I also kind of, have seen and observed of particularly young generation, but, of folks across the age spectrum is, that we're no longer seeing our own social justice movements as discrete and separate as perhaps folks saw them before, and people, particularly young activists, saying LGBTQ and queer justice movements is related to climate change, is related to racial justice, and all the many things that so many of us care about. And so I know the task force work intersects very directly and very intentionally with the whole range of movements, from reproductive freedom to racial justice. So maybe you could talk a little bit more from your vantage point as a national advocacy and training organization. What do you see as the most urgent concerns?
I feel like it's tre'andre already said so many of the things that it was top of heart and top of mind for me. And I do want to say around how we need to level up as it relates to making sure we're not leaving non-binary, gender non-conforming, folks behind. We have to ask ourselves the question, particularly as we have more access to power, is what we're doing reaching non-binary folks? Is what we're creating as solutions or proposing as solutions, does it actually have the intended impact that we want it to have for our entire community, right? And who's slipping through the cracks? And I'm happy to say that, those conversations, of which the task force was a part of, happened with the Equality Act, which we'll talk a little bit later about ensuring that the language that is being used in the Equality Act is being interpreted in a way that is inclusive, right, of our entire community, right, including non-binary folks. And so, but it took folks to say it and to name it and to really think about, shoot, does this piece of legislation actually protect all of our people in the way we intended and wanted to? Okay, what do we need to do to make sure that happens? So I want to say there's a culture shifting piece of this, and there's a power and policy piece of this, right, that is important to remember. So that's, I think, important. We talked about eradicating violence against trans women and Black trans women in particularly is top of mind. You also talked about economic security. I think there is real work for us to do in expanding this narrative about who LGBTQ people are, right? I think oftentimes, the narrative, comes with an implication that queer people are rich, right? Like that we are all sitting on like piles of money, like remember Scrooge McDuck, like diving into our like piles of gold, like like it's not real. It is not true. tre'andre was talking about, transgender folks it's economic security is a top issue, and it should be when the majority of trans folks are making, less than $15,000 a year. When we know the data says that 40% or more of young people who are homeless identify as LGBTQ, right? What is the pipeline? Like, where's the safety net? What are the job securities? Where is the training, skills training? So I do think there's more work to be done around the future of work, the future of workers. What does economic security look like uniquely for our community? Like, where are the barriers and how do we approach them, both in a hearts and minds ways, but also policy? And then an issue that's personally important to me and to the task force is restoring voting rights for returning citizens. This for me is like the quintessential example of an intersectional issue, right? There are so many of them, and this one in particular is one that I'm excited that we're going to be doing more work on. But, you know we've got to rebuild our democracy. We've got to revision our democracy. We've got to strengthen this democracy. And there is intentional targeting of our communities to take us out of the political process, right? I will never forget, a mentor of mine, said in super simple terms, if voting wasn't important, why are they trying to take it away? It doesn't work like that, right? No one's mobilizing to take your vote away if they don't think it matters, if you don't have power, right? And that is what is happening. And we know who's sitting in prison, right? It's disproportionately people of color. Women's prisons are the fastest growing prisons in the nation. We're talking about these young queer babies, right, who are getting tracked into prison as juveniles, right, where we know there's more trauma, more violence, more attacks on their humanity, right, which only puts them back in the cycle of incarceration. The majority of the states in this country have restrictions on voting if you've served in prison. In some places it's a felony, in others it's a misdemeanor, right? Sometimes it's a few months, sometimes it's for the rest of your life. So for me, you can't tell me prison reform isn't a queer issue. You can't tell me voting rights is not a queer issue. You can't tell me racial justice is not a queer issue. I'm not hearing it, right? And I think that is so important to move the LGBTQ movement, but also move our sibling social justice movements to be rethinking, expanding who we think of as the most affected. So often it is not LGBTQ people. And again, if you just take some time, we start to see how we are disproportionately affected by these things.
Thank you. Mary, what would you add to this conversation about the most urgent needs and issues facing our community? And I would love for you also to talk a little bit more about the, really deep work you've been doing on juvenile justice up in Maine.
Well, I have to say, I just found both of your responses just awesome. And, tre'andre, for example, like when you say it's great to get laws, but it's not enough. I agree. There's so much unfinished work that we have to do, and you've both given really rich examples of that. And so, just to Janson's point, it's part of why we have been digging more into systems, the juvenile justice system, the child welfare system, adult prisons. Like it's clearly people who matter. It's all people, right? It's our people. It's like LGBTQ people. It's like all of it. So we have been digging in. And I'm not even sure what I can say about all that, given that there's a lot of that work. But we're on that, and we agree that just having non-discrimination laws is not going to solve those issues. And tre'andre, when you talked about how the laws are not enough, I also have to say, like, I don't want to lose any ground that we've gained in that, and I think there's more to gain now. And so I'm just also very conscious of that. I understand people need to recover. To try to get their energy back for those affirmative fights. We've been on defense for a long time now, but I'm really hoping that we can use this time that we have to move forward in so many ways, because we need to, and those issues you talked about are example. I'm just going to say, is like the white person on this thing, like I just feel like everybody needs to, and every organization needs to be really thinking through a commitment they're going to make on anti-racism work and disestablishing white supremacy. And it's like got to be like a really conscious thing every day. Anyway, I don't need to lecture everybody about this, but I just want to say, like, that's a real priority in our work that you're both assuming, and I'm just going to say out loud. And I guess the last thing, and Kira, you kind of mentioned it, like around voting and the threats to our democracy, but I think we all saw this chasm opening up before us on January 6th about what the world could be like. And I share all of your concerns. And I guess I would just also say, when I think about, I know we have so much progress to make, but when I think about the progress we have made, part of it has been because we've been willing to engage with people and talk about our lives and try to find some areas where we could agree or narrow disagreements. And I have to say, I think it's important that we continue to do that work of persuading other people to be with us and that we're with them, so that we can build durable majorities um, that are going to be anti-racist, that are going to be pro-LGBTQ. Because I just don't know otherwise how we ever really get the security we all need and deserve.
Thank you. Well, that was certainly a really comprehensive, and just a tip of the iceberg analysis of like what's facing our communities. And I'm now just want to switch now to, talking a little bit about the opportunities that we have to address some of those issues, and also what are the tools that we should be using to take advantage of those opportunities. If I could stick with you, Mary, for a second, I mean, what are those bright lights? What are those opportunities? What are those openings? And what are the tools that you think will be most powerful to take advantage of the moment we're in?
Well, some of what's happening right now is pretty exciting, right? In terms of executive orders and so on from the Biden administration, but I assume we'll talk about those in a minute. But when it comes to tools, and I have been in this movement officially now for like 31 years. So I will just say that I feel like we have gained so much over these last 31 years in terms of competencies, and I don't want to lose them. We do know how to talk to people who disagree with us, and it's hard, but we need to do it. We do know a lot about litigation and making policy. We do know a lot about trying to lift up people's lives, tre'andre, about to say this is a person full of worth and dignity, and we can't treat each other this way. I mean, I want to make sure that we're firing on all cylinders and doing the litigation and the policy work and the public education engagement that we need to do. And that I know it's tempting with a federal administration that's more supportive to spend all our time there, but the state and local work is absolutely essential. And, tre'andre, I think your work of Yes on 3, for example, in Massachusetts, and, holding our, trans public accommodations law, like, just shows, right? It was a breakthrough nationally, and it makes a difference nationally, right? So I just feel like we have all of that kind of work to do. So do we have like tough waters to navigate in various areas? Like, for example, the federal courts? Yeah. But will we? Yes, we will, because we're going to have to be in each of those domains in order not only to try to protect what we've gained, but to keep making gains. Because in the end, like, I'm just going to say, I have to say this, like, the fundamental promise of our Constitution is we all come before our government as equals. We can never let go of that promise and keep asking our governments to live up to it.
Mary, you flattered me so, because I was not the Yes on 3 person. Just FYI.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
That was my predecessor. That was Mason.
That's
Dunn.
right.
That was
all right, but you get it too.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yes, I just wanted to add about that. It is also about our humanity, right? Like the making the gains of our humanity, and it's been about how we have been able to see each other as human beings, right? As people who want that self-actualization to reach that full potential, right? So it's been about that storytelling and that connecting about our common interests, right? And the common interest is about living with respect and dignity.
Well, tre'andre, I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but let's talk about it now, since we're already, on the subject of kind of state-based work, and then we'll transition to the work at the federal level, including the Equality Act, which I promise to all the listeners we will get to, because it's been a busy week for the Equality Act. But tre'andre, what opportunities are you seeing at the state level, specifically in Massachusetts, and what would you say to other folks working in other states? And feel free to draw on whatever experience, whether it's the Yes on 3 referendum in Massachusetts, which was the 2018 referendum to try to roll back protections for trans people in public accommodations. And I'll just say that there's somebody in the chat who said, take the compliment. So take the compliment, tre'andre. Whether it's that experience or any other experience that you've had at the state level, because I think there are both lots of threats, but also opportunities at the local state level. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so right now at the state level, what we're seeing is there's a lot more movement for towards inclusion, right? Particularly around, I know the city of Boston just passed an initiative with changing their forms so that their forms, all city forms are now going to have gender neutral options, right? We're seeing a lot more conversation. I feel like a lot more people are reaching out. We're just starting to have this conversation at our, at our schools or in our workplace. And how can you help us navigate these conversations? There's definitely things that are happening legislatively. So we've got the Gender Marker X bill that's going on, which at this point really is about making sure that people have a have another option other than M or F, right? So and that this option is throughout all Massachusetts IDs. There's currently a bill that is about having gender neutral bathrooms. So it's just about adjusting building codes so that when there is either a new building or a renovation of a building, that they're making sure that there are gender neutral bathrooms available. And so I think that there are definitely some, a lot more positive things happening. And at the same time, like, yeah, it doesn't necessarily negate the work, right? I think we have an opportunity to invest in community, an opportunity to really provide more resources, to really put money where your mouth is, right? Invest in the community, invest in education, invest in the organizations that are actually doing this work and pushing the needle forward. And because I don't know if anybody has seen, but there was a recent report where Boston was not, there's a report about how Boston is not actually investing in Black and Brown small businesses. And so we need to be doing more of that. We need to be putting more money into community and not just hoarding money, because I think that tends to happen, right? And the money just sort of like stays at the top. It's about, sharing space and moving aside and making us and stepping away from just holding on to things so much and just really sharing. You got to share the wealth, right? Because our young people need it. Black and brown people need it. Or our elders need it. We all just really want the opportunity again to thrive. And so invest in community and stop putting people in prisons.
Well put. Mary, Kira, is there anything you wanted to add or react to that tre'andre just said before we shift topics to talk about federal work? All right, well then let's talk about what's happening in DC. There's a lot. Obviously, this has been a jam-packed week, but let's start with the executive orders that came out on day one of the Biden administration, and then it's only continued since then. And Mary, maybe you could just kind of give a little bit of an overview of what we've seen so far come out of the Biden administrations with regards to executive orders and how big a deal is it?
Thank you, Janson. There are a bunch of executive orders. I was going to speak about, since there's a bunch here, focus on the LGBTQ focused.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first ones out, the first evening, was one that used the Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia decision as the basis. And that decision, as you may know, written by Justice Gorsuch, it was a 6-3 opinion, said when it comes to discrimination, it was in employment, but discrimination that's based on sexual orientation or gender identity, that is because of sex. And that is not permissible. You are discriminating based on sex when you discriminate against folks on those bases. And using that as the basis, the executive order made it clear that when we're talking about sex discrimination, we're not just talking employment, we're talking housing, we're talking Immigration and Naturalization Act, we're talking healthcare, we're talking very broad, really ticked off a number of areas. And that's so important. And because again, there are so many laws in our nation that already forbid sex discrimination. And I think it's fair to presume that that means they apply to LGBTQ plus people as well. So having the government come out so strong on day one about the reach of Bostock and the impermissibility of discrimination, it's important. It sets a national norm, it sets a tone. It doesn't change everybody's behavior or attitudes overnight, but it's important to have that norm that says discrimination is not permissible. So that's one thing. Beyond that, you may know that the HUD, that HUD also issued a follow-up to say that when it comes to the Fair Housing Act, again, Bostock controls, sex discrimination controls, there's no discrimination against LGBTQ plus people. There was a further executive order about the Transgender Military Ban, and thankfully that's now history. And it's beyond even just reversing the ban. It's also really intended to try to make people whole in some ways that are very important. So that's incredible. And one other one I'll just mention is to have the State Department really work to promote respect for the humanity and dignity of LGBTQ people worldwide. Because with the previous administration, there was a concerted effort to really undermine human rights of LGBTQ people worldwide. So that will be a welcome turn of events. And there are so many other things that are underway, but those are, I think, some of the more key ones at the moment.
Thank you. And, I think as we're also well aware now, the executive order is only as good as your current administration, but certainly, if there's a change, they're all at risk. And so maybe, Kira, you could talk a little bit about the Equality Act, which passed yesterday in the House. I forget the exact vote count, but I do remember there were 3 Republicans joining, and it was introduced in the Senate on Tuesday. So those who aren't aware of the Equality Act, this is legislation that would add those non-discrimination protections that Mary was just talking about, but they would add it legislatively across, a broad range of areas, including employment, housing, education, credit, jury service, and public spaces like restaurants and businesses. So how important is the Equality Act, and what do our chances look like? And what's the landscape?
You already answered why it's important. For all the things you just said, the Equality Act is a real, it's a step forward in securing federal protections, civil rights for LGBTQ people. Mary talked about, Bostock, talked about HUD, talked about these other executive orders, and all of those things are needed. They are great things. We need to celebrate every single one of them. And equality isn't in any one of those things, right? Like I keep telling people, you can't give a piece of equality. It doesn't work that way. Either it's the whole puzzle or the puzzle's not done, right? If we don't have it all, we don't have equality. And this is getting us one step closer to equality and equity by expanding the civil rights laws to extend to LGBTQ people, but there's also a broadening, right, that it extends to public accommodations. And I actually think somebody mentioned that earlier too. So it's restaurants, right? It's your stores, right? Like that you walk into. It's often the very different types of places you might walk into or not at a mall, right? It's so important, Janson, because of what you just said. An executive order is only as good as your administration, right? And this is a piece of legislation that doesn't, right, is not at the whim of a president or an administration, but this is something that has roots, right? It has roots in the people, it has roots in multiple members of Congress. It allows the people to hold the country and the electeds at any given time accountable, to use your term, Mary, to remember the promise, right? To never back down on this promise, which is what this legislation is, which is that discrimination against LGBTQ people will no longer be permissible. What I do think is that we've made a lot of headway already, right? The people are always ahead of elected officials, right? Like, we know there's broad support. It's like across political spectrums, across faith communities. The people overwhelmingly support the Equality Act, right? So in that way, I think that's a hurdle we've crossed. Now, another challenge is that a lot of people think that we already have these protections, right? Folks it's amazing when we're educating or having conversations, people are like, wait a minute, that's legal? What? No, how can that be legal? Is that legal in my state? Like, that can't be legal in my state. And the reality is that you may have protections, state protections or city protections, but you cross over into another city or district, you cross state lines, and you may lose that. Again, having protection in one state and none of the bordering states around you is not equality. It's not good enough. It's not good enough. Never has been, and it isn't now. And we're in a good place. Like, again, we were talking about hope. I haven't experienced hope like this in the 25 years I feel like I've been doing this work, where a whole movement of people, right, multiple communities actually see, right, that they can see the light at the end of the tunnel, that we might actually be able to make this happen in the next 2 years. And so it's about moving our electeds, right? It's about doing, taking them where we already are. Which is letting them know that their constituents are, again, across, partisan lines, right? Like are in support of this bill. I had a great conversation with a senator last week, and there was a trans man who's a constituent on the call, and his wife, and it was really powerful for him to talk about his identity as a Texan, right? He born and raised in Texas. I love my home state of Texas. Texas has come a long way. I want to be here. I want my family to be here. My extended family is here. I want us to continue to level up and do better. But what he did say is, I am actually not worried about my job because my headquarters is in California. He said, if I had to find a job here in my home state of Texas to support my family, he was like, I would be really worried. He's like, that is how we're falling through the cracks. I don't think I would be able, right, to do what I need to do with my, for my family. And we got to change that. So I think we're in a good position. Organizations across the movement and cross movement are working together to make the Equality Act possible and realized and passed and made the law of the land.
I think you're absolutely right to point out that the constituents are there. It's the partisanship and the elected leaders who aren't. The most recent poll I saw stated 8 out of 10 Americans support the Equality Act, almost 7 out of 10 Republicans, and substantial majorities of every religious group, including evangelical Christians. And I think what we're seeing is our opponents understanding what broad, deep support the Equality Act has, and they're resorting to their typical playbook, which is to focus on fear. And I was actually just on a call-in show this morning about the Equality Act, and every single call that came in was about this fear of transgender girls competing against cis girls and taking away their scholarships or whatever, their championships, and really pitting communities against each other. And so I wanted to kind of, switch to that for a second and talk about these attacks we're seeing both at the federal and state level, particularly as it relates around transgender athletics, but also healthcare as well too. And tre'andre, maybe you could start us off by talking about, even if these laws don't pass, like what makes these attacks so dangerous, and what can we all be doing to support young trans folks?
Janson, you brought up that point earlier, right? That even if these bills don't pass, it's having a severe effect on their mental health, right? And people's and their health outcomes. And what's dangerous is that it continues to breed misinformation about who trans girls are, and about trans identities, about young people and who they are, and because they know themselves, right? It's not like, trans people are doing this for attention, because let's be real, the attention that trans people get is mostly negative. And who wants to put that on themselves, right? And so, and I think it also affects cis people, right? And young cis people. It also affects non-binary youth, because there's such this hyper focus on trans girls, and specifically, really what it is about their genitalia. And it's this weird, bizarre focus on that adults have on these youth. And to me, honestly, it is really what they're trying to legalize is like the sexual harassment of young trans girls. And that's just not okay. Right. And then these trans girls are growing up thinking, like that they don't belong anywhere. And that's absolutely not true. And I think that narrative needs to shift. That conversation needs to shift. And also just the hyper focusing on trans girls, it's complete erasure of trans boys and non-binary youth. Now, I'm not saying now come on and go after these non-binary youth and young trans boys. Absolutely not. But there's just this weird hyper focus, and I just think it's bizarre. I really do.
Well, we, here in New England are certainly not immune, and we're seeing, first litigation in Connecticut against the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Association, which did adopt inclusive policies for trans athletics, and that's now being challenged. And we're also seeing legislation passed for the second session in a row in New Hampshire to ban trans inclusion athletics. Mary, what would you add about why these attacks are so dangerous, and what can we do to stop them from becoming law?
Well, I heard the word humanity earlier. Like, it feels so direct about people's humanity and the legitimacy of their existence. So they are awful. And I get the message that they convey. In fact, I think, we do a lot of work in schools, and it's been really interesting to see how this kind of thing plays out, because I think young people get it when one group is fear-mongered about and scapegoated, then you're also a danger too. Are you going to step out and be non-conforming in some way that's going to bring something down on your head? So I just want to say, like, it's absolutely targeted, trans and gender non-conforming youth, but it's also like felt so broadly in terms of creating a climate of fear. So they're destructive on many levels. And in terms of what we can do, I mean, again, it was terrible that Idaho passed, but a lot of bills can't read that. Us. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So we've had a good track record so far. I think last I counted, there were 17 bills on sports alone. And I think we got to tell young people we have their backs and work like heck to defeat these things. And in fact, the whole way, not to be on defense, but to be on offense, about the beauty and the dignity of these young people, and we've already seen it happen in a couple of states where there have been young people who've been willing to speak out and say, I just love to play soccer. And it's so relatable. And I think, we've got to just keep, if people are able to do that kind of thing, to be there for them. In Maine, where there is such a bill also, or there's 2 bills coming, we've already been preparing for that. And there'll be many, many people really standing extremely strongly with our young people. So we can't keep people from doing this stuff, but boy, can we rise up and maintain our humanity and dignity the whole way through it.
The last topic I want to just talk about, and then I'll give everyone some time to make some closing thoughts, is about the courts. And there's been a lot of questions about this in advance. And I'm going to look to you, Mary. So we've been talking a lot about legislations, and the courts remain a vehicle, both for us to advance progress, but also for our opponents to chip away progress. And so with the transformation of the federal judiciary in the last 4 years under the Trump administration, what do you see the role of the courts being in our movement?
Well, earlier I said that I thought we needed to still use all tools, and that remains true. There's times when we absolutely have to be on offense in courts, and there's times where we're going to be dragged in on defense. So there's that. And in terms of, we've seen a number of tough issues recently, including Masterpiece Cake Shop, the baker, the religious claim, and a public accommodation. And, we live to fight another day. There's a very important case now pending Fulton that will be decided by the end of this term. So this is all, by the way, on a palette where the Supreme Court has been remaking law about religion and so on. Anyway, all to say, we're going to be there no matter what. And I think one of the things that's really improved over the years is the amount of the fact that we really see ourselves more as one justice movement, and there's a lot of really great collaboration that happens among all people who care about pluralism, but really care about making sure there's equity and equality for everyone. So that's one thing that I would say about the courts. The other thing I just want to note is that, yes, it's true that the last president appointed a lot of judges and justices. And, starting on January 21st, there started being existing federal judges who were announcing their retirements or that they were taking senior status so that the new president could replace them. So I just want to say that that's happening. And I'd also want to say that there's times when we win in front of judges who were appointed by the past president, because Constitution still is what it is. Basic bedrock promises still are what they are. And so that gives me some hope. But I will say that, it's true that there are people who really want to work to undo everything that we've gained. And, like, for example, when it comes to Bostock, I know some people have been concerned about that. I don't think that's a likely loss. I really don't, just because it was 6-3, written by Justice Gorsuch, joined by Chief Justice Roberts. People have worried about Obergefell. And it's true that it's in the crosshairs of some folks, but I just want to say it would be shocking for the Supreme Court to take that away, the marriage decision. And I say that in part because it's just so woven into the fabric of so many people's lives nationwide. It'd be very disruptive to do that. But again, this is not a court that's been afraid about being disruptive. But, in the end, the decision was right. It really was. And it's going to be, I think, a real task for them to take that away. And, just speaking about the federal courts, even during this last administration, there were really important wins, not just in the Idaho sports ban case, but on behalf of students, trans students, coming out of the GG case, in Virginia, and then the Fourth Circuit, coming out of the 11th Circuit in Florida, that are really understanding that discrimination is real and it's really not okay. And so I just want to say that as much as some of us may be focused on law and policy, you made a comment, Kara, about how people get things that the courts and the legislatures don't. Well, that's kind of true. You see a lot of places where an anti-discrimination rule is not compelled, but it's what's practiced, because people recognize it's what kids need to learn, what workers need to thrive, and so on. So the courts are part of the mix. And I think, again, we don't want to lose any ground, and we want to keep making ground, and we're going to need to be there. But I'm also really happy that there's this synergy between the courts, the legislature. I'm hoping it's going to actually help the Equality Act get passed, because we've already gotten so far with sex discrimination. But anyway, we're going to be there.
Thank you. Well, we are towards the end of our time, so I want to just, give you an opportunity for some very brief parting thoughts, and I'll maybe just set it up this way. We're at the end of a Friday, end of a long week, but at the beginning of a new year and the beginning of a new administration. So what gives you hope? And let me start with tre'andre.
I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's really the young people. They have so much passion. They know what they want. They know what's right. you know, and they're so creative. They're imagining new futures. They're imagining new communities. And I am so willing. I'm so ready to, to see who takes the next mantle of MTPC. Then, the next young person to take the mantle. I'm not saying I'm a young person, because I'm not. But yeah, the young people, they really do. They give me hope.
Mary?
I hate to say me too, but that's where I landed. I mean, I take great inspiration from, I always have, from the people that I meet who are trying to do the right thing in their own spheres of life and are brave and bold. But the young people and the clarity they have, like you say, the creativity and the courage, I feel like maybe we could accelerate the pace of change here. And they look at people like, my generation and just say, you messed up. Why should I listen to you? And I get that.
And Kara?
I'm gonna go the other end. I am inspired by elders who change, who shift, who continue to evolve and grow. When I came out to my dad, who passed 5 years ago, he was in his late 60s and he didn't talk to me for 3 months. And that man, that old Black man, shifted. Do you hear me? He was like, you changed my heart. You changed my mind. He was learning stuff. We had a heart to heart where that old Black man admitted to me how hard it was to talk about the things that he did and he said to perpetuate homophobia when he was young and in the military. The words he used, right? The jokes that he said. I mean, he was in tears, right? And so I'm inspired when the people we think aren't our people are our people. Those rural white folks in Kentucky, right? Those country Black folks in Alabama, those Baptists, those Mormons, right? Like the older folks that, our great aunties. They are shifting and they're changing, and I am inspired because there is room and an opportunity to do that at every age, and we have to be committed in that journey with all of our people.
Wow, what a tremendous way to end this program. Thank you so much, Kira, tre'andre, and Mary. Thank you all for attending today. Once again, I encourage you to check out each of the organizations online to learn more about their important work, how you can get involved, and most importantly, how you can support these amazing organizations. If you are in need of legal information or a referral to a lawyer, I want you to know that GLAAD is a resource. Our GLAAD Answers service is a legal information referral service that you can contact. Just go to gladanswers.org. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful weekend.